Okay, did anyone watch that 90s Merlin movie with Helena Bonham Carter and Martin Short? I hadn't thought about that movie in decades, and then Morgan Le Fay popped up in a Nat Geo I was reading, and it all came flooding back. After reading it, I decided I wanted to paint her, but I wanted to learn more first. I wanted it to be accurate, so I decided to do some research. In true academic fashion, I wanted to be thorough, so I began by watching the 1998 Merlin. With that out of the way, I dove into books and articles about her, but like a true nerd with a bad attention span, I got completely lost in the research void. Guys, I genuinely just wanted to see if I could throw in some Easter eggs, make it a bit more interesting, really get back to the folklore. And then I discovered all these articles about her, and to be honest, lost way more time than I'm proud of. I honestly had never looked into her story before. I just remembered her from this old movie I watched on a loop. I was probably, oh my God, 8 or 9, and we had a VHS copy of the movie, so I watched it a lot. I've definitely seen Merlin, Atlantis, and the Mummy more times than I can count. But who was Morgan Le Fay? For now, I didn't even care to answer that question. In the movie, I actually always loved Queen Mab more. I don't know if it was the amazing costumes, her smoky voice, or the dramatics, but she was a favorite. As a kid, though, I couldn't stand Morgan Le Fay. She was pouty at the best of times and vengeful at the worst. She mostly just came across spoiled. Despite how many times I watched that movie, I never dove into her theory and legend because as I got older, my attention shifted, and when I did my undergrad in ancient history, it primarily focused on mythology. So Morgan just sat in my mind as a character in a movie that I watched as a kid. She was grouped in there with Harriet the Spy and Laura Croft. Then this year, at Thanksgiving, I spotted a Nat Geo Halloween special on witchcraft, which obviously I had to buy, and there was Morgan, sounding nothing like the spoiled cliche that I remembered. As I said, I thought researching would give me some relevant symbols I could include to make it more legit, and instead, I learned about centuries of literary evolution that I was not expecting. So, I am going to paint Morgan Le Fay today, but I'm also going to share what I learned and the decisions I made when I finally sketched out how I wanted the art piece to look. I almost feel bad now for how much I rolled my eyes at her as a kid because the more I read, the more I realized Morgan Le Fay is a really interesting figure. I was not expecting to uncover hundreds of years of decline in her character by author after author. So, of course, I wasn't a fan of her. She had spent centuries becoming someone you definitely were not meant to be a fan of. So, when did Morgan Le Fay first show up in literature? In 1150. In Vita Merlini, where she's first ever mentioned, the author describes her as the one who is first among them has greater skill in healing, as her beauty surpasses that of her sisters. Her name is Morgan, and she has learned the uses of all plants in curing the ills of the body. She knows, too, the art of changing her shape, of flying through the air like Daedalus on strange wings. Arthur is brought to her after being wounded in battle, and the text makes quick mention of her taking him in and helping him heal. I was surprised she was never mentioned again because we have such a strong image of her now. Not only that, but there was no negativity in that original source. So, where did this angry, malevolent version even come from? An essay by Jessica Hines pointed out that Morgan's image began to shift in the 12th century as she keeps her healing abilities, but her position changes. Hines writes, no longer the sole ruler of Avalon, she's been demoted to the lover of Avalon's ruler. Chrétien's French successors extend this political decentering and begin to treat her knowledge of the magical arts with deep suspicion. From there, Morgan's stories build to involve ambition, jealousies, and a love affair. I loved when Hines wrote, her beauty, which in the Vita was a reflection of her inner creativity and goodness, transforms into a sign of sexuality run amok. Partially because it's so well written, and partially because I love when people use amok. In each story, Arthur is always brought to her for healing, just as he had been in the original Vita, but her energy, corruption, and motives continue to darken over time. I do have to acknowledge there's a lot of mention in other literature about a correlation between Morgan, the ancient Welsh Modron, and the Celtic figure the Morrigan. Some believe her connection to Celtic myth is how we get the addition of Le Fay, which likens her to Celtic fae, fair folk fairies. I want to focus mostly on the Arthurian side today, but I would love to do a video on the Morrigan herself at some point. Also, probably the Fae. But getting distracted is how we got into this mess, so we are going to focus. So back to Morgan's dark, witchy new aesthetic and toxic personality, which Hines describes as literary misogyny. And of course, I started this because I wanted to depict Morgan Le Fay accurately, so this shift created a new problem in my project. Was she this beautiful and kind healer, or a bitter temptress trying to sabotage the king? I found an amazing article. I'm actually going to cite everything below if you guys want to check it out. This one was by Cindy Media Villa that talks about this exact phenomenon and how Morgan Le Fay was depicted in television. They even mentioned my childhood favorite and how, for once, they didn't make her the primary villain, but also that they didn't give her too much depth. I have to say, Helena Bonham Carter, as always, nailed the role. This is not a comment on her at all, but more that it's interesting to see as an adult now why I never cared for Morgan Le Fay, despite her long running appearance as either Morgan or Morgana in television and movies. This article goes on to talk about her depiction typically revolves around the men in her life. In some retellings, she's Arthur's half sibling with whom she has an affair and later betrays. Often, she's the corrupt sorceress opposing Merlin's heroic magic. In no way did that very first line in a 12th century story, where Morgan was mentioned, I think maybe twice, did it give any indication of these changes. And yet, her story got darker, more twisted, and more incestuous. Though in literature, it seems more recently her name is being reworked, her story retold, and like many other villainous women, she's being given the space for complexity. But Media Villa points out that in film and television, that's still not really the case. She says, on television, she has remained for the most part an evil caricature bent on destroying Arthur for her own nefarious purposes. That line hit extra hard because I thought of the times I'd heard versions of myself from others that I felt sound nothing like me, like they were painted in the same two-dimensional brush of villainy. I thought of friends of mine that confided in how misrepresented they felt in a situation because they had been upset or set a boundary that wasn't taken well. It's hard not to liken ourselves to the stories we read, and I would bet that I'm not the only one who was hit hard by Morgan's shifting narrative. Even in National Geographic, she was painted as an ever changing vision of a woman that would change to reflect whatever the story needed. Other mythology and folklore books I picked up acknowledge her changing image, but would pick one and retell it in that way, which frankly I totally get because how do you even begin to retell her story when there's no one clear story to tell? It almost felt like nothing and everything was canon when it came to her. The irony is that I started this research to gain more insight on who she was so that my painting could be more accurate. And instead, I wound up more lost, more confused, and honestly more desperate to give her something, a voice, a solidity. But who am I to decide that? Who am I to take nearly 1,000 years of literature and film and make Morgan Le Fay? Because in the end, isn't that what every other author, painter, and filmmaker was doing, depicting their Morgan? I even tried to create a narrative timeline for this video, but trying to include every version and every mention of her would have meant you'd be stuck with me for hours, which anyone who knows me knows I'm chatty as hell, but I didn't want to subject any of you to that. Nor did I look forward to trying to compile 1,000 years of ever-changing retellings into a cohesive narrative, because, well, I'm a little lazy. So how did I come up with her design? I can't say that my version of her is accurate, but instead of accuracy, I tried to channel complexity. Her evolution reminded me of how many times someone's story made me a villain, of all my friends who felt misrepresented in someone else's narrative, of how we deserve to be seen as complex people. The more stories I read, the more I actually thought of Madeline Miller's Circe. I love that novel because Circe is real. She's broken and she's powerful, she's complex and nuanced, and I wanted to give that to Morgan. So I included nods to Avalon, her healing abilities, and her knowledge by painting her surrounded by greenery and books, but I also included her darkness, her anger, and the gloomy color palette and having her turned away from the audience, caring more about her island than paying attention to any of us. I'm leaving it up to the audience to decide if she's brewing poison or medicine, to decide how they want to interpret her after this. In the end, this was the Morgan Le Fay that compelled in my mind, and hopefully I did her justice. At least, I hope I gave her the decency of complexity.